We read the following in Romans chapter 10, beginning in verse 14. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? How will they believe in him whom they have not heard? And how will they hear without a preacher? And how will they preach unless they are sent? Just as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who proclaim good news of good things. However, they did not all heed the good news, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our report? So faith comes from hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how will they believe in him whom they have not heard? And how will they hear without a preacher? And how will they preach unless they are sent? Open-air preachers are to be sent by the local church. Open-air preachers are to be called by the local church. I have spoken to many open-air preachers over the years who truly believe that they are called of God to proclaim the gospel in the open air. I'm one of those people who believe that God has called me to this task. When I first started open-air preaching about 16 years ago, I believe that call was valid simply because I really wanted to open-air preach. I mean, certainly if I want to do this, if I want to stand up on a box or on a street corner or on a bench somewhere and open my mouth and do the unthinkable thing in the eyes of many Christians and herald the gospel in the open air, certainly if I want to do that, then God must be calling me to do that. And I learned over time that I was, in a sense, trusting in some extra revelation from God. I certainly couldn't open my Bible and see a command or a call from God for Tony specifically to go out onto the streets and proclaim the gospel in the open air, to be a preacher of the gospel in the open air. But because I believed it in my heart, I believed, well, then God must be speaking to me. God must be telling me to do this. Now, while there is certainly an internal call in the sense of the man called to such a ministry, that call must be validated. That call must be affirmed by the local church. We have no examples in the Word of God of a man calling himself to the ministry of the Word of God. Not even the Apostle Paul called himself to that ministry. None of the apostles called themselves to that ministry. They were called by Jesus Christ directly to that ministry. We cannot claim that today. Jesus is not directly speaking to any open-air preacher today. We have the Word of God now in its entirety, and God speaks to us through His Word. He does not speak to us through extra-biblical revelation. Even men like the Apostle Paul and Barnabas were sent out by the local church. They were given instructions as to where to go and what message, or letters they were to carry from the church to other churches. They did not simply go out on their own. Philip was sent out by the local church. We read that Philip, of course, was taken up by the Spirit, that he was sent into Samaria. But later on in the book of Acts, we see that Philip is actually given the title of evangelist. And that title wasn't given to him by himself. That title was given to him by the local church as a man who was sent out by God. Evangelists in that day, the title of evangelist was given to men who were literally the assistants to the apostles. If you had the title of evangelist, you were sent out by one of the apostles to proclaim the gospel. You assisted the apostles in that work of evangelism. And that work was often, if not exclusively, regarding the planting of other churches. Wherever the gospel was proclaimed, churches would be raised. Again, there were no nomads in the Word of God. And so it is very important that the open-air preacher is sent by the local church. If you are someone who has a desire to open air preach, then your first conversation should be with your elders. You should be sitting down with your elders and expressing that desire, a desire you believe is God-given to go out and proclaim the gospel in the open air. And then it is the responsibility of the elders to vet you, so to speak, to qualify you for that role, to train you to that end, and to send you out. And that could look different in different churches. Maybe in one church, they will ordain a man to the gospel ministry on the streets. Maybe in another church, it is some form of commissioning that man to that role. Maybe it would be of a laying on of hands by the elders, either privately or either publicly before the congregation. But however that autonomous individual church determines to send men out onto the streets to preach the gospel, the men are to be sent by the local church. And as I've mentioned before, to those who think that, well, my pastor's never going to send me out, my elders are never going to send me out to preach, my elders either don't believe in open air preaching, but they don't think I'm ready for open air preaching, well, then you need to submit to that authority. Maybe you're not ready. The fact that you want to open air preach doesn't mean that you're ready to open air preach. It doesn't mean that you're equipped to open air preach. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily mature enough to open air preach. When I decided that I wanted to be a deputy sheriff, I didn't go to the store and buy a gun. I didn't go to a store and buy some kind of security badge. I didn't outfit my personal vehicle with lights and sirens. I didn't paint it black and white and go out and start to enforce the law on my own because I decided that I wanted to be a police officer. No, I applied for that position with the department. It took almost a year for the department to decide that they were going to even begin to train me to see if I could even do this job. And then it was another 4 or 5 months of training in an academy. And once I successfully completed that, then there was another 6 months of training on the streets before they would send me out on my own to do the work. And it's very much the same, or at least it ought to be the same, in local churches. You know, and it behooves pastors not to simply welcome a man who wants to open air preach and say, oh, that's what you want to do? Great, go do it. No, you should shepherd that man. You should love that man enough to sit down with him to see if he's biblically qualified for that. What is his home life like? What is his personal study like? Have you ever heard him teach before? Have you ever heard him proclaim the gospel before? You shouldn't just send that man out onto the streets without any kind of training or oversight or counseling or support, whether that support is physical or spiritual. You should not just simply be throwing men out into the wolves with no oversight or training. No, you need to love that man and determine whether or not that God has indeed called him to that kind of ministry of the word. You should take that pastor as seriously as you would take the man who comes to you and says, Pastor, I think I've been called to be a missionary. I think I've been called to pastoral ministry, to the preaching ministry of the gospel from a pulpit. As seriously as you would take a man coming to you with those desires, you should take the man who comes to you with the desire to preach the gospel in the open air. So as much as important as it is for the open air preacher to be sent by the local church, it is equally important for the church to be sending that man to the streets. Again, don't simply affirm someone's internal desire to preach the gospel in the open air as a call. No, work with that man, vet that man, interview that man, counsel that man, disciple that man, train that man. See if he has the patience to wait. See if he has the humility to wait to be sent. And then once you have done that, if you believe as a collective group of elders that this man has been called to the gospel ministry to proclaim the gospel in the open air, then send him out. Send him out, support him, be with him out there on the streets. Go out there, watch him preach, listen to him preach, watch him interact with other people to make sure that what you saw in this man is actually what's true about this man when he's put out into the field. And to you who has a desire to open air preach, if you have no desire to be sent by your local church, then you ought to examine yourself and test yourself, not necessarily to see if whether or not you're in the faith, but whether or not you truly are called to open air preach. Is it really about proclaiming the gospel the right way in the right places at the right time? Or is it about your own desire to preach? Is this more about you wanting to preach than it is about you wanting to proclaim the gospel? Are you in love with the proclamation of the gospel, or are you in love with the idea of preaching? And a good way to find that out, an appropriate way to find that out, is to go to your elders, submit to their authority, and ask them to examine you carefully over time to determine if you are in fact called to the ministry of open air preaching.